In this presentation, we will discuss the historical origination and current status of TOGAF, the most famous enterprise architecture framework or standard. First, we will discuss the historical evolution of architecture planning methodologies through decades, starting from information systems plans in the 60s. If we look at the historical literature about planning information systems in organizations, then we can find the article called Master Plan for Information Systems, published in 1962 in Harvard Business Review. So this presentation is based on original snapshots from different articles and sources, and this is a kind of a screenshot from the original article, Master Plan for Information Systems. This article describes a methodology for planning information systems in organizations and defines 5 high-level steps that organization needs to follow to plan its IT landscape. First, it starts from establishing some long-range goals, so what you would like to achieve, or what is your target state, then defining your current system, so what you have now, and then eventually you come up with action plan, and then finally you accomplish the plan. So this article was historically the first article that presented a prominent methodology for information systems planning that already defined the familiar logic that can be found in most current methodologies, so current state, future state, gap analysis, action plan. This is all already presented here in some form or the other. Next, methodologies were proposed by major companies, and one of these companies, or central of these companies, was IBM, International Business Machines, at that time. The first methodology that they proposed was called Study Organization Plan, SOP. This is again the original screenshot from the source documentation of this methodology. This methodology was proposed in early 60s and then was promoted till the late 60s. This is the screenshot that demonstrates the content of this methodology. So what it includes? So again, step-by-step process where we have stages and phases. Everything starts from understanding the present business situation, so what we have now, then defining system requirements, what we would like to have, designing new systems, so how we build it, and then we implement all that. So basically this is again some sort of step-by-step approach where you analyze what you have, define what you would like to have, and then thinking about how can that be implemented and implementing that. So again, step-by-step methodology based on some formal analysis of what you have and what you would like to have. Next one is business systems planning. This is also a methodology promoted by IBM. This is a very famous methodology, and even today you can find some people who are aware of this methodology. What we can see in this methodology, these are all screenshots from original BSP manuals. And there are many interesting things can be found here. First of all, on the left-hand side, what we see is a number of domains addressed or covered by these methodologies. And what are these domains? It is interesting to see. Organization, processes, systems, and databases. Organization and processes today would be called business architecture. Systems will be called application architecture. Databases, data architecture. Surprisingly, but what is missing in the business systems planning methodology is the domain of technology. And popular myth circulating in the enterprise architecture community currently suggests that initially enterprise architecture was purely technical and only then embraced business domain. But what we see actually the situation is quite opposite. Earliest methodologies actually paid more attention to business and didn't really discuss technology, surprisingly to many. What else can we see here? On the right-hand side, which is called here Figure 3, we see the logic of top-down analysis and bottom-up implementation advocated by BSP. It starts from defining business objectives. So today it will be called business strategy. Then business processes and business organization, that will be called business architecture. Data processing applications architecture. Then data files and data classes, databases, data architecture. And then you build information systems, changing business processes and reaching business objectives. So this is a clearly logic that is can be found everywhere today. You start from business strategy, then you do business architecture, application architecture, data architecture, and then you kind of implement that through information systems. So this familiar logic was already there exactly 50 years ago. Also, Here is also the original quotation from BSP. A fundamental tenet underlying BSP is that an information systems plan for a business must be integrated with the business plan and should be developed from the point of view of top management and with the active participation. This is exactly what is promoted today. Everybody is saying today that planning of business and IT should be integrated and business people should be involved in that and so on. So some people think this idea is new, but this idea was clearly formulated 50 years ago already. And finally, on the right-hand side, there is a detailed step-by-step methodology of how BSP study should progress. This study includes a number of steps where you gain some top management commitment, then you organize some meetings, then you do some analysis of your current situation, define your desirable, ideal situation, do some discussions, and then eventually you implement, you produce an action plan, and eventually you present this action plan and get it approved for execution. So actually BSP methodology was very famous, very influential, and most of the today's methodologies can be viewed as descendants of BSP, and most of the ideas that many people think are new or belong to current methodologies actually are 50 years old, as we can very clearly see from this slide. After IBM started to promote BSP methodologies, other consultancies started to copy this methodology and propose very similar kindred methodologies, introducing some variations to the original BSP methodology with some new elements, but fundamentally they were all very similar, provided step-by-step approaches where you, in some form or the other, in some sequence or the other, you document current state, define future state across the 4 domains, and then you produce some action plan and you implement it. One of these methodologies, one of the most famous clones of BSP, was Method 1, promoted by Arthur Anderson. Currently it's part of Accenture. What this methodology included? It's also presented here, some slices from original documents. You define scope and scope of your organization, then you analyze your strategic positioning, you analyze your present situation, you analyze some opportunities for using IT. Then eventually you produce organization plan, which is business architecture, data and applications plan, which is data and application architecture, technology plan, technology architecture. Then you create information action plan. This is kind of roadmap or transition plan using current terminology. And finally, you launch the project. Similar methodologies were proposed by other consultancies as well. This one is called Summit S, incoming from Coopers and Lebrand, currently PwC. So what is there? You see that there is a rearrangement of steps, but fundamentally it's all the same. We start from some business preparation, business planning, strategic business vision. We also see here business architecture. Explicitly term is already used, even though the methodology is quite aged. Then we assess some current situation in parallel. Then we proceed to some other things like application architecture, data architecture. We do some presentation, do some justifications, prepare some transitioning, and fundamentally, eventually we produce some strategic IT plan that is then submitted for approval of business leadership. This is another methodology called Forefront from Deloitte and Touche, currently just Deloitte. Also the same, a number of phases where you have some steps starting from your organizational analysis, business architecture. You can see here explicitly data architecture, application architecture. In parallel, you create some inventory of current information systems, evaluate them, produce some action plans, present them for business management approval, and then you proceed with the implementation of the plan. So basically all the same. Another wave of methodology was called information engineering. Information engineering is also was a broad family of step-by-step information systems planning methodologies that emphasize the importance of information. Authors of information engineering methodologies promoted the idea that applications are quite volatile, but data is more stable. And if you start your planning exercises from defining proper data classes or data entities that your organization operates with, then your resulting plan will be much more stable. And therefore, they a little bit rearranged the sequence of steps in planning methodologies, where you analyze your business, and then next you analyze data that business operates with. So data became more important in these methodologies, but fundamentally it was just a rearrangement of steps. where importance of data was emphasized. But fundamentally, again, all these methodologies were about following some steps, current state, future state across multiple domains, and then producing some roadmaps. So this is the version of information engineering promoted by Arthur Young company. Currently, it's EY. Out of these companies, individual gurus also started to emerge. Initially methodologies they emerged from BSP, that was proposed some kind of seminal methodology, that this methodology was then copied with some variations by other consultancies. And then individual gurus that previously worked in these consultancies also started to work as independent consultants. All of them are previously worked in these consultancies. One of them was Dennis Conner, for example. This one is a snapshot of the methodology from his book. This methodology itself is shown on the right-hand side, where you also start from business strategy, define some architecture across different layers, starting from information architecture, including some information entities. Then you define some technical architecture, migration strategy, tactical plans. So fundamentally all the same, a little bit different fashion. On the left-hand side, interestingly, this is the first methodology that started to promote some metrics-like structure for organizing the deliverables of the methodology. So currently, if you Google for different enterprise architecture frameworks, they all provide some matrix structures for organizing deliverables. And this one was the first methodology that explicitly linked the deliverables of the methodology to some cells of the matrix that logically organizes these deliverables. And here we can see organization according to several domains like business, data, application, technical environment, and type of plan, and also 3 different levels of abstraction: strategic, tactical, and operational. So this was an interesting milestone. The first methodology that explicitly used matrix structures for organizing the deliverables. This methodology was called STRIPE, Strategic Resource Information Planning and Execution. This is another methodology, another variation of information engineering from one of the fathers of information engineering, Clive Finkelstein, Australian. This methodology implied also analyzing the business, extensively modeling your data at the strategic, tactical, and operational levels, and then out of that you produce some more tactical, more designs of applications, and then you create these applications themselves. This one, another methodology from Atkinson, Tremblay and Associate Company from Canada, called IS Master Architecture and Plan, ISMAP. Also, very similar methodology that starts from describing current situation, understanding business, then defining target situation through some steps, eventually producing transition plan, how you migrate from your current state to the future state. This one, another guru, Edwin Tozer. This is his methodology, called simply Strategic Information Systems Planning. Also the same, different stages, different phases. Some stages are executed in parallel. Different stages, they produce some deliverables. Logic is the same. You analyze business, then define some target architecture in some form or the other, compare it with the existing architecture, and finally you present plans and obtain approval for the execution from the top management. So exactly the same. Then this methodology started their adoption in the United States government organizations. Specifically, governmental organizations, they studied industry practices from commercial organizations and started to adapt these practices to their own internal governmental purposes. And they developed their own versions of different methodologies and different approaches existing in the industry. So this is the first methodology created specifically for governmental purposes. And this methodology is obviously inspired by all the previous methodologies existing in the industry and repeats their logic pretty clearly. So what do we see here? Also starting from some mission and strategy, then we do some functional analysis, informational analysis, data analysis, then applications, systems, and so on. And finally, we end up with target architecture selection. This methodology includes some iterative features where we kind of can roll back from every step, but fundamentally it's all the same logic. where we do some step-by-step planning from current situation to target situation through a number of domains. This one is the next methodology developed specifically in the US Department of Defense, called Technical Architecture Framework for Information Management, TAFIM. What can we see here? On the left-hand side, we see four familiar domains of enterprise architecture: work architecture, which is business architecture, application architecture, information architecture, and technology architecture. And all that is governed by common architecture principles. So a pretty familiar picture. On the right-hand side, we see a methodology itself. It's an iterative methodology where we follow some steps in circle. These steps include some preparation, then some baseline characterization, which is current state documentation, target architecture definition, and then some migration planning and implementation of all that. So fundamentally, it's the same old logic that we saw before, where we follow the steps, produce some documents, compare current and desired state, and then deduce some implementation plans out of that and execute these plans. This one is the first methodology that was explicitly called enterprise architecture. The title of the methodology was Enterprise Architecture Planning. It's considered to be the first methodology that explicitly uses the term enterprise architecture. It was proposed in the early 90s. Before that, different terms have been used, like information systems plans, information architecture, information systems architecture, data architecture, information service planning, and some other peculiar titles. But since the early 90s, the term enterprise architecture became popular, and that was the first book that actually named this phenomenon enterprise architecture. So the methodology itself is shown here on the left-hand side. It's sometimes called wedding cake because it resembles a wedding cake, where you start from some, you initiate some planning, then you do some business modeling and description of your current systems, so where we are today. Then you define your target architecture across three domains: data, application, and technology, where we want to be, and then you do implementation and migration. So the term enterprise architecture was really new, but the approach itself was not old, was not really new, and actually resembled, copied all old approaches existing before. And on the right-hand side, there is an explicit quotation provided from the book, where the author of the book explicitly states that the EAP methodology has its roots in IBM's BSP. BSP we discussed several slides ago. That was very influential methodology that actually defined many of the things that we see today in enterprise architecture methodologies. And this first enterprise architecture planning methodology was actually, it was explicitly acknowledged by its authors that the methodology was actually inspired by BSP and largely copied from BSP. So methodology was positioned as kind of new, and term enterprise architecture was new, but again, ideas were very old. Now we will discuss these methodologies at work, how often they were used in organizations, how organizations actually implemented them, and what were the outcomes of their implementation. First of all, we need to say that these methodologies were very popular, and there were many companies that promoted these methodologies. For example, the first book about enterprise architecture planning, contains Appendix B, which includes a number of consulting companies that provide enterprise architecture planning services. So superficial analysis, or people who do superficial analysis, when they read this book, they say that that was the first book that defined enterprise architecture. But actually, this book itself suggests that enterprise architecture planning services have already been provided by the time of its publication by so many companies. And here is the list of companies provided here. These companies include many of those companies whose methodologies we discussed a few slides ago, including, for example, companies like Atkinson Tremblay, and many others like Coopers and Lebrun, for example, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, things like that. All these methodologies we discussed previously. So essentially, every self-respecting consultancy company had some information systems planning or enterprise architecture methodology that basically were variations of the same themes of current state, future state, across different domains, roadmaps, and so on. In total, in literature, there are probably 20 or 30 different methodologies can be found, and this is only what was published like publicly. So if we look at the implementation of these methodologies, how they were implemented, there are many different sources that explain what happened when companies implemented these methodologies. And what we can say that methodologies were actually followed. What I mean is, if methodology defined, for example, 10 different steps and 10 different deliverables, then organizations using these methodologies, they really followed these steps and really produced these deliverables. So methodologies were kind of implemented in a literal sense, closely to their prescriptions. And there is some statistics available about how much time did it take for organizations to implement these methodologies that suggests that on average it was about maybe 6 months. So for 6 months, there was a dedicated team of people that really followed the methodology, performed the analysis described in the methodology to document the current situation, define target situation, and create roadmap, and everything that was described in the methodology were actually carried out by specific teams of people. So methodologies were implemented as described. Now the question is, how many companies actually used these methodologies? If we look at the literature in the 70s or 80s, impression is that all companies are using methodologies because literature was all talking about methodologies of different sort, BSP and different variations. But if we look at different statistics, which is also available from different sources and different countries, all these statistics clearly suggests one thing, that methodologies were not really widely adopted, and all statistics suggest that on average they were adopted by probably 15 to 25% of all organizations, maybe 1/5 of all organizations across the industry. And these statistics come from different countries, including United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Ireland. So all statistics suggest that actually few companies followed these methodologies or used them in practice. But the majority or vast majority of companies actually had some kind of homegrown methodologies. So they did not use all these branded, promoted step-by-step methodologies, but did something else, homegrown. And finally, were the organizations using these methodologies happy with them? Again, there is many research performed on that by different universities, some worldly famous, some are not that famous in different countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia. And they all suggest that companies were actually unhappy with these methodologies. And specifically, there were many problems of these methodologies listed, but they can be reduced probably to 3 key problems. First of all is the execution of methodologies is very laborious. You need to have a dedicated team of 6 to 8 people, maybe on average, that also worked for maybe 6 to 8 months full time to just analyze the organization, perform all the necessary analysis, create all the necessary deliverables. This is actually a time-consuming and laborious exercise, and this is a kind of significant investment for the organization. The second problem, also pointed out by many different people who researched this application of these methodologies, is that deliverables produced as a result of their execution were not really understood by anyone except their own creators. So other people in the organization, they didn't understand these deliverables that describe some plans about how their system should be organized. They just didn't understand it. So they were arcane to everyone except those people who actually produced them. And the final problem was that planning, in the case of these methodologies, were disconnected from other planning efforts in the organization. So essentially, it launched some separate parallel planning cycle in the organization. So businesses thinking about one thing, what we are going to do, and some other dedicated team of planners initiates some other planning effort, and they, in parallel to regular business planning, start to define some target state for the organization. So that's why they were disintegrated from each other, happened separately from each other. So that's why organizations were basically dissatisfied with all these architecture planning methodologies because they required lots of time to execute and produced basically heaps of cryptic deliverables that nobody can understand except their creators. And typical fate of these deliverables was they turned into shelfware, so they were never implemented or few things of them were implemented that were obvious well enough before the methodology. So they didn't really provide any value. Now we will discuss the inception of TOGAF. So where did it come from, and what did it propose, and why it became so successful? First of all, the emergence of TOGAF. So where TOGAF actually came from? One of the few things that TOGAF documentation actually says correctly is that TOGAF was copied from TAFIM. TAFIM we discussed a few slides before. It's a technical architecture framework for information management, developed in the US Department of Defense, but inspired by all other methodologies that provided circular step-by-step process that implied current state, target state, gap analysis, roadmap, things like that. This methodology was abandoned by the United States Department of Defense and then taken by the Open Group and turned into TOGAF. So TOGAF manual explicitly says that actually TOGAF originates from TAFIM, and also some other observers also notice the similarity between the two methodologies and say that there is almost a palpable isomorphism before them. So it's like if you read TAFIM manual and early TOGAF versions, they just represent very close branches of the same text. And TOGAF version 3, this is the earliest picture that I was able to find anywhere, was actually literally a copy of TAFIM picture. You will see only some renamings taking place, but it's exactly the same 7 phases. They just a little bit renamed, but fundamentally it's all the same. So actually, where TOGAF came from? TOGAF was initially copied from TAFIM with some very superficial renamings, and earlier versions of TOGAF were basically copies of TAFIM. What happened then? How did TOGAF evolve? If we look at the evolution of the ADM circle during different time periods and in different TOGAF versions, we see some small differences. For example, versions 3 to 4, they were just literally copies of previous TAFIM circle. Versions 5.7, there is only new is requirements is added, center of everything. Next, version 8. In version 8, some rearrangements of phases took place. So phases B and C, that were baseline description and target architecture description, they were rearranged along different domains. So they turned into phases B, C, and D: business architecture, information systems architecture, and technology architecture. So instead of doing first current state across all domains and then target states across all domains, we reorganize this logic by domain. So for business architecture, we do current and future. For information systems, we do current and target. And for technology, we also do current and target. So basically, we just a little bit reorganize them, but fundamentally, just a slight reorganization. And then version 9 didn't really change anything, but introduces some minor renamings. So basically, if we look at the evolution of TOGAF from the earliest versions to version number 9, evolution was just included rearrangement of some of its phases without really changing the substance of what was proposed or promoted. If we look at TOGAF as a planning methodology, what did it propose actually? If we carefully study TOGAF manual version 9, then we see that TOGAF actually prescribes a very detailed step-by-step methodology. This is like manifested in many places in its documentation. It's again some snapshots from the original documentation that says that TOGAF provides a detailed method for developing architecture, a step-by-step approach. It's also a detailed model of outputs created by the ADM circle, that ADMs describe what needs to be done to create an architecture, and content framework describe what the architecture should look like, and so on. So basically it defines very carefully all the steps necessary to create architecture and also deliverables that you need to produce. And each of these phases is very carefully defined also in detail. Each phase has some objectives, some inputs with a long list of documents, some steps that you need to take. So every phase has a number of sub-steps, and in total I think it's about 85 different steps, and each phase also includes a list of outputs. So this is a very detailed methodology where you have a number of high-level phases with a number of sub-steps. Each of them has some inputs, outputs. It's a meticulously defined methodology. Another interesting thing is TOGAF version 9 included a thing called the table shown on the right-hand side, classified different sections of the TOGAF into a number of categories, whether these are mandatory or optional. And all these phases were actually classified as TOGAF mandated. And TOGAF mandated meant that, as highlighted here, are central to its usage, and without them the framework would not be recognizably TOGAF. So what that means is the documentation suggested that all that was not really optional, that this is essential part of TOGAF, all these phases, inputs, outputs, steps, and deliverables. So it was a clearly well-defined step-by-step methodology. The problem, however, with this methodology was that previously we already had tens of different methodologies, and they all proved impractical. It is interesting to notice that, for example, first enterprise architecture methodology, enterprise architecture planning, also its authors clearly suggest, as shown here, that the vast majority of enterprises that undertake enterprise architecture planning are not successful. So the authors acknowledged themselves that this methodology was not really workable. In the middle, there is a snapshot from the book about early TOGAF version that analyzes why TEFIM, TOGAF predecessor, failed. And they actually identify the same three problems, that it was very laborious to do all that, and deliverables were not really understood, and so on. So they suggest that TEFIM was also not successful, even though TOGAF was based on TEFIM. TEFIM actually failed. And then another famous book, Enterprise Architecture Strategy from MIT, also starts from saying that traditional architecture planning methodologies didn't really work. So the thing is that TOGAF emerged as a methodology, but when it emerged, impracticality of the approach promoted there was very obvious. But nevertheless, TOGAF became quite successful. Why did it happen? This is obviously not related to a practical side of things, that methodology was not workable. But what factors contributed to the success of TOGAF in terms of public adoption? First of all, there was a new hype around the new concept of enterprise architecture. Previously, all methodologies, as we discussed, they were all discussed information systems plan, information system architecture, but the term enterprise architecture was new. It emerged in the 90s and then became very popular in 2000s, and then the hype started. And there was actually a certain methodology around, a certain mythology around enterprise architecture. One of elements of this mythology is that enterprise architecture was invented by John Zachman in the late 80s, when his famous article, Framework for Information Systems Architecture, was published, and people started to say that this was actually the first ideas about enterprise architecture that later inspired all other frameworks. But as we discussed previously, it's not at all like that. Previously, we had tens of different methodologies from all possible consultancies, and later methodologies simply copied them. But in the public space, this myth became very widespread, and most people will say that enterprise architecture emerged from John Zachman's famous framework, but it has nothing to do with reality. Another thing is that systems planning was kind of renamed to enterprise architecture. Previously, all methodologies were used simply methodology around systems planning, and then new terminology became popular, enterprise architecture, and that's why all previous methodologies, they were forgotten, kind of, because they discussed something different. Enterprise architecture was new, but systems planning, people forgot about the existence of that. And also, previously, all these approaches were called methodologies because they proposed actually methodologies step by step. And then all these methodologies, they were renamed to frameworks. So what happened is, instead of old information systems methodologies that discredited themselves, we now have enterprise architecture frameworks that rhetorically sound as something very new, with a new father. But actually, all these current enterprise architecture frameworks are copies of these information systems planning methodologies, just renamed. But this renaming contributed to the adoption of a new concept of enterprise architecture, and so this helped to forget all the legacy of failures and wastes associated with previous architecture planning methodologies, and started kind of a new hype around the old idea under the new label. Another factor was the proliferation of planning practices in organizations, because really organizations started to adopt more IT, their landscapes grew, and they needed more planning. That's why there were a kind of objective need for some planning approaches, and that's why TOGAF kind of become demanded. And also lastly, the last factor contributing to the success of TOGAF is marketing efforts of the open group itself. First of all, TOGAF was positioned as open framework, not proprietary framework. If we look at all the previous planning methodologies, all these methodologies were promoted by some companies. So that was IBM's BSP, Arthur Andersen Method 1, also all other methodologies were proprietary to their own creators, to consulting companies or consultants that promoted these methodologies. And the open group proposed TOGAF as some kind of open framework, everyone's framework, industry consensus framework that is not proprietary to any organization but can be used by anyone. So it kind of joined everyone under the same umbrella. And also the open group proposed some sort of a franchise model so that everyone can join the trend. If you want to teach something, you can get a license and teach TOGAF. If you want to promote your consultancy services, you can again pay some fee and use TOGAF as a label for your consultancy services. If you sell any tools, you can also pay some fee and say that your tool is TOGAF compatible. That's why efforts of the open group consolidated different market players under the common label of TOGAF. Now, what do we know about using TOGAF in practice? What is declared about its usage, how it is actually used, and are there any examples of using TOGAF in practice? First of all, if we look at different modern statistics available regarding the usage of enterprise architecture frameworks, then the picture is pretty clear. Initially, TOGAF was one of the few frameworks used in organizations, and then over the years its adoption grew, and eventually it became the leading framework. So most people, if you ask them a simple question, what frameworks do you use, with a list of checkboxes, many people today will tick TOGAF. So in terms of numbers, TOGAF is widely used. So statistically, it's very popular. But if we look at whether companies actually followed what TOGAF prescribes, there are no examples of any organizations working as TOGAF suggests. Actually, there are only many elusive explanations how people using it or how it's meant to be used. So usually, if you ask if there is anyone who will tell you that they use TOGAF, what they really will use is only 4 domains that do not belong to TOGAF and exist for 50 years. But most statements about using TOGAF, they are equivalent to having these 4 domains addressed in some way or another. And here are some of my favorite quotations from different studies that demonstrate how people describe the usage of TOGAF. So one quotation at the top says that this is a head of enterprise architecture practice. He claims that TOGAF is the key framework that we use, but the only aspect of TOGAF that is currently active is domain partitioning. That's it. So 4 domains. Some other elusive explanations that very few people who use the whole ADM but align the practice to something, that you need to look at the TOGAF as a collection of tools, that the whole point of the framework is you modify it for your organization and create your own version of TOGAF. And my favorite quotation is provided here on the right-hand side, that you take TOGAF out of the box, start to adopt it, and eventually TOGAF frameworks still inside and powering your enterprise architecture, but no longer very visible. So it kind of is not used in any kind of visible fashion, but it somehow powering your enterprise architecture practice. So these are all explanations about how you use TOGAF in practice. It's only you pay lip service to it, but what you do in practice is nothing special. You just address these 4 domains as all other previous ideas suggested, but you don't follow any of its recommendations specifically. So in all cases, the use of TOGAF is purely declarative. So people say that they use it, but don't really do anything. So if we look statistically, yes, many people say kind of we use it, but really, do you follow that? No, no one does that. And there are no examples available. There is one TOGAF case study that I found in the literature where an organization, it's a number of educational institutions in the UK, they started to adopt enterprise architecture and decided to use TOGAF. So what did they do? They tried to they studied documentation, addressed some training, they even become a premium members of the open group. But what did they actually report? That we thought that TOGAF was a methodology, but it turned out to be impractical. That we visited some TOGAF trainings, but they only demonstrated some documentation without any realistic examples. Also, they requested the open group to provide some examples, but these examples were not provided. That practical information was not incoming from any sources, and also neither the open group itself nor TOGAF trainers were able to explain in the practical terms how it's expected to be used or provide any practical examples how that can be used. So this is a typical case study of using TOGAF. When people read some marketing materials, decided that it's very valuable, very useful, but then they were not really able to do anything or get any realistic information about what needs to be done with it or explanation how it's intended to be used. So all the attempts to use TOGAF only caused confusion across the companies trying to implement that or trying to figure out what needs to be done with these methodologies that is obviously not workable. So what happened then after the initial emergence of TOGAF? How it started to develop after version 9. One key trend that can be clearly observed since version number 9 is semantic erosion of TOGAF. Every new release of TOGAF is more vague than the previous one. Version number 9 described in a clear fashion very detailed step-by-step methodologies with clear deliverables, and it was all, as we discussed previously, classified as mandated, so kind of necessary parts of TOGAF. But because this methodology never really worked and no one was able to use it really, what we started to do is started to blur the methodology, making it more vague and reject all the previously given promises about this methodology. For example, one notable start of this journey is in TOGAF version 9.1. This document categorization model has been removed. So previously, this document categorization model explained what is mandatory, what is optional. Now it was removed, so everything became optional. Using TOGAF doesn't really, nothing is mandatory, everything is optional. And latest released version number 10 even removed all arrows from the methodology. So previously it was clearly positioned as a step-by-step methodology, and it was repeated many times in many contexts. But now they say that it's not actually a methodology, not a sequence, that ADM does not mean that phases need to be followed in any particular sequence. So what does it mean then you need to do? When everything is optional, there is no sequence, what you are expected to do with it? It's not even clear. So currently TOGAF rejects any specific suggestions about its usage. Previously, the message was very clear. This is a methodology for you with steps and deliverables, and you need to follow it. Now, semantic erosion has led to a situation when it's not even clear what you are expected to do. They don't promise anything. They say everything is optional, there is no sequence, no nothing. Do whatever you like. One notable feature of TOGAF currently is its ambiguity. Analysis of current documentation suggests that there are many statements that patently contradict each other. For example, on the left-hand side, there are some statements that suggest that TOGAF is a process, sequence, linear process, and so on. On the right-hand side, where these statements are denied. For example, one piece of documentation explains it as a testable and repeatable process. generic process, recommended sequence for the various phases and steps involved in the development of architecture. This is TOGAF says. At the same time, in other places it says that ADM should not be understood as a process model, is not a linear process model, and steps do not have to proceed in a sequence. So in some places it says clearly that it's a sequence and process. In other places it says it's not. So TOGAF is currently, you can find confirmation of any idea. If you present, for example, TOGAF to students who don't understand anything, to some bachelor level students in universities, you can tell them TOGAF is a clearly defined process and refer to the documentation and say, okay, you see, it says that. If you present TOGAF to practitioners who are perfectly well understand that step-by-step approach doesn't work, you can say, TOGAF is not a step-by-step approach, and refer to the quotations provided on the right-hand side so that you can present it to any audience and explain it in a way they wish to see it. So TOGAF is not something concrete, it's just whatever you prefer to see in its documentation for you. Another thing is TOGAF adapts rhetorically to all the industry trends and buzzwords and hypes. For example, in the mid-2000s, the popular hype was around service-oriented architecture. And of course, TOGAF started to say we also support service-oriented architecture and support the integration between TOGAF ADM and service-oriented architecture and so on. So we embrace this hype, support your efforts to implement service-oriented architecture. Then, in the late 2010s, business architecture was very popular and there was a hype around business architecture, and TOGAF also readily included some statements about importance of business architecture, and we also kind of support business architecture and help you implement that. And now there is a big hype around the buzzwords like agile and digital transformation, and the latest announcement about the release of TOGAF, of course, tells us that we also support agile and digital transformation and help your organization to implement one. So what that means is TOGAF rhetorically adapts to all the hottest topics. Whatever is demanded in the industry and whatever people are seeking, TOGAF always tells them we support them that, and we will help your organization to implement all that. That's why we kind of stay always relevant to your needs. So what is the current status of TOGAF after all this long story? What does it mean now? Why is it so popular? Who supports it? And who benefits from its promotion? If we look at TOGAF today, what it is? Firstly, previously TOGAF stood for the Open Group Architecture Framework. Now it doesn't have any meaning at all. I mean, today TOGAF doesn't mean the Open Group Architecture Framework. It's just a 5-letter word that doesn't have any explanation. It's an acronym that cannot be deciphered. It just sounds as TOGAF standard. That's it. It's a cryptic title that doesn't really mean anything and no longer refers to an architecture framework. So everything can be encompassed by the TOGAF standards. No, it's not really an architecture framework, and it's just a label under which everything can be positioned. If we look at the TOGAF content, previously TOGAF was one file of about 600 pages, but now it is extended to include both TOGAF fundamental content and the series guide that together compose up to 1,800 pages of text. This text is incoherent, internally inconsistent, and unintelligible. If you try reading it, you will very clearly see that this text simply makes no sense. TOGAF was also split into a number of PDF files, including the main TOGAF document and also some supporting guides. So today what we have, instead of one clear document with a clear scope so that you can say what's in scope and what's not in scope, currently there are tens of different PDF files and different people view them differently from the standpoint of their being part of TOGAF. So currently today it's not even possible to say what is really part of TOGAF and what's not part of TOGAF, because it's all kind of separated into a number of loosely related PDF files. So the scope of TOGAF itself became very unclear. Today TOGAF also doesn't provide any specific suggestions whatsoever. Everything is optional. Previously it was a methodology that prescribed some steps, some deliverables. All that did not work, but that was like not workable methodology. But currently it's just nothing. It gives no prescriptions, no suggestions. Everything is optional. You don't need to follow steps. You don't need to do that. You don't necessarily need to use these documents or that documents. So you just read it and do whatever you like. This is the only meaning. In this light, TOGAF became absolutely unfalsifiable. So it cannot be proven and cannot be disproven, in a sense that You can only prove or disprove something that provides some clear suggestions that you can try and say, okay, this works, it doesn't work. But currently, the only suggestion is like do whatever you like, take whatever works for you, and in this sense, it cannot be neither proven nor disproven. And especially in their marketing materials, they like to use the word proven very much. It's repeated in many contexts that TOGAF is proven framework, proven standard, the most reliable architecture methodology that is used by companies, very proven. But when nothing really is being suggested, how can you prove that? How can you disprove that? It just became absolutely unfalsifiable. Cannot be neither proven nor disproven. Also, TOGAF is unable to provide answers even to the most basic questions related to enterprise architecture. For example, if we look organizationally, your enterprise architecture efforts should be framed as a project, process, or sequence, or practice, or what? All these terms are widely used in the standards. In some places they say that they refer to some architecture projects, as if all your architecture efforts are framed as project. Somewhere they say it's a process with some sequence. In other places say that no, that's not a process, not a sequence, and not a project. So even at the highest level, TOGAF cannot say what enterprise architecture efforts in organizations look like, whether it's a process or project or something else. There is no answer even to this basic question. Using TOGAF today means only reading it, or maybe at best getting certified, because in any practical terms, using it doesn't mean anything. You don't, by using it, you are not obliged to do something, or not even recommended to do something. This is just something like bunch of ideas for you, and using them means just taking out of this bunch of ideas whatever you like or whatever you need. So using it doesn't mean anything at all, just getting TOGAF badge. This means using it. Also, there is a popular discussion in the community that TOGAF is a kind of toolkit where of many different tools you can pick what tools you like, what tools work for you, and use them. The problem is that no one was ever able to say, okay, what tools are actually provided and what tools actually work in practice. And if we look in detail what tools are there at major components of TOGAF, for example, such as ADM or Architecture Content Framework or Enterprise Continuum or some other models from TOGAF, none of these major models actually work in practice or relate to practice or correspond to real best practices. So even if we look at TOGAF as a set of tools, we can only say that it's a set of useless tools, none of which is actually practical and actually work or resemble what happens in organizations practicing enterprise architecture with successful outcomes. And therefore, today, TOGAF can be viewed only as an empty symbol that doesn't really mean anything at all. It has no concrete substance in terms of, in practical terms. It does not suggest anything. You just take this bunch of documents and do something with it. It gives no prescriptions, no recommendations, just something like that. And really what it means today is it's a purely a symbol that you can use to indicate your belongingness to some broader community of architecture practitioners or open group members, or just indicate your significance, that you are educated, you are relevant, you are something bigger than you are because you are kind of TOGAF certified and something like that. So there's absolutely no substance, only symbol. Why TOGAF is attractive? It's an interesting question, and there can be many discussions why people kind of believe in TOGAF or get attracted to it. First of all marketing materials promoted by the open group and people who sell it, they all promise some kind of best practices. They all say that TOGAF is, yes, a proven framework, best practices used by leading companies, but none of them can actually say what these best practices are in terms of practices that really work in organizations. And usually people talk about some fundamentals of enterprise architecture. They say, yes, it's not all implementable in that fashion, but it provides you with some kind of fundamental things about enterprise architecture. But these discussions about fundamentals are not really specifiable, so no one can explain what fundamentally it provides about enterprise architecture except few definitions and 4 domain models. So it's a few pages of valuable text out of 1,800 pages. So what are these fundamentals that are provided there? Nobody can clearly specify. Another element of that is assertive positioning of TOGAF. So If you Google for TOGAF, they say it's a global standard. So probably it suggests that it's something very important and cannot be ignored, and you need to understand it. You need to get certified. How can you ignore it if it's a global standard? At the same time, positioning is also elusive. So they say, yeah, it's only a framework. So it cannot be blamed for any failures of your enterprise architecture practice. And people will tell you that, well, it's only a tool. It doesn't guarantee anything. You need to use this framework wisely. It's not a recipe that you can just follow. It's only a framework, something that you need to adopt. So on the one hand, it tells you that I'm very important. On the other hand, it tells you at the same time that I'm not really expected to provide any particular suggestions. I'm only a framework. So it's on the one hand very important, and on the other hand doesn't really promise anything. And that's why it's kind of standing prominently, but without really doing anything. Another aspect is that TOGAF rhetorically supports all major trends and hypes, supports everything, starting from SOA in 2000s, then cloud, agile, digital, artificial intelligence, whatever is currently popular. They issue some marketing materials that TOGAF embraces, supports all that, helps you do digital transformation, agile transformation, whatever you are seeking to do, TOGAF helps that. Another major reason of its attractiveness is TOGAF provides some sort of a win-win bandwagon for all people who sell something related to enterprise architecture. It's a label that everyone can use to sell their consulting services, to sell their certifications, tools, and so on. So whatever you sell, you can benefit from adopting TOGAF label and paying some fees to the open group for your right to use this label. So all sorts of salesmen, including those people who sell something useful or purely snake oil salesmen, they can all benefit from using this label. That's why everyone prefers, everyone who is selling something to enterprise architects or enterprise architecture in the enterprise architecture space aligns their offerings with TOGAF rhetorically. And finally, TOGAF has unfortunately been institutionalized in the field, in the sense that nowadays in many CVs, for example, or in many positions, they expect you to have TOGAF certification. And you have to go to get TOGAF certified just to meet some criteria or indicate your desire to grow to enterprise architecture space or develop as an enterprise architect. So from the standpoint of different human resource management processes, TOGAF badge became quite a desirable feature to have, quite an important thing that can help you to find a job or deserve some promotion or signify your importance or things like that. So that's why it became kind of demanded. And finally, who benefits from TOGAF? Certainly not enterprise architecture practitioners. This is simply because TOGAF gives no real knowledge of enterprise architecture best practices, because this knowledge was never there. As we discussed previously, TOGAF historically was just copied from some previous methodologies that proved impractical and failed. So originally the content of the TOGAF standard is based on some approaches that never really worked. So they just happened to be there by accident, and so they just took some methodologies that never really worked, started to promote them as best practice, making them more vague, but that never represented anyone's best practice really. And today TOGAF only for practitioners promotes some dangerous misinformation about enterprise architecture and architecture practices, because if you look at all the most widely known suggestions of TOGAF or models of TOGAF, like for example TOGAF ADM, well, we need to say that very clearly, that this never never worked successfully anywhere, and that's why this constitutes dangerous misinformation. People who study this information, they just get wrong conception of enterprise architecture practice, with which they need to unlearn this conception before they can really start practicing anything. That's why just it actually harms practitioners, because they instead of real best practices, it provides them with some misinformation about enterprise architecture practice. But who are the real beneficiaries of TOGAF? First of all, this is of course the open group itself. The business of the open group can be characterized as business of selling badges. Currently, the open group has probably about 100 badges sold somewhere on their website. For each badge you need to probably get some training, pay for some examination, and so on. So Open Group is a major beneficiary in the sense that sells lots of different things to people, and people pay money to get these badges that don't mean anything, don't educate anyone, but just are purely symbolic. Open Group is not alone. Open Group is surrounded by different trainers, TOGAF trainers. This is a community of TOGAF trainers who are also interested in promoting TOGAF because they charge for teaching this kind of false best practices. So they sell their trainings, and currently these trainings are worth, for example, in the United States, I think about $3,000. For what? For teaching ideas that never really worked. All these people, of course, they make significant profits just from nothing, from selling symbolic badges. Also, certification centers are involved there because they all kind of make some profits from all these exams, certificates, and so on. And generally, all sorts of salesmen are all beneficiaries of TOGAF, because under the label of TOGAF they sell something like consultancy services, software tools, I don't know, something else like speaking engagement, or maybe some other things. But fundamentally, beneficiaries of TOGAF is a community of salesmen who capitalize on the brand, who create some profits just distributing some random questionable information that doesn't represent anyone's real knowledge or best practice, but they're just making money on that. So we can say that TOGAF basically it's a sophisticated contraption for attracting incomes for different parties who want to sell anything, and they can each party that has something to sell in the enterprise architecture space can always use TOGAF as a brand for their selling activities and attract some audience for that. But so for practitioners it gives absolutely nothing, but for people who sell something it gives a lot. So who supports TOGAF? So in some cases you can see people kind of promoting TOGAF. If you look at who is doing that, there are three categories of people or parties who do that. First of all is salesmen. As we discussed, these are key beneficiaries of TOGAF. If you see anyone promoting it, most likely these people sell them. They are commercially motivated to sell it, to praise it, to promote it as proven best practice, to say that you need it. They invest lots of money and effort in marketing TOGAF, and wherever you go in any kind of discussion groups, you will see TOGAF, TOGAF, TOGAF. It is being promoted for commercial purposes, and all the promises of best practices is just marketing, nothing else. Another group of TOGAF supporters are aspiring enterprise architects. So people who want to become enterprise architects, but who are not really yet enterprise architects. These people are not really knowledgeable in practical realities and cannot critically evaluate TOGAF and all the associated discussions. So they are initially indoctrinated by different salesmen to believe in TOGAF. They, for example, if there is someone who wants to become an architect, he or she will Google for enterprise architecture and find TOGAF there. And there will be a number of enthusiastic salesmen who tell them, yes, it's best practice, global best practice, proven, created by collective mind of enterprise architecture practitioners. And aspiring architects start to believe in that. And because they are not aware of practical realities, they cannot question all these promises. And they or some of them become enthusiastic believers of TOGAF just because they were kind of indoctrinated into the dogmas of TOGAF rather than saw anything like that working in practice. And finally, last category of people who support TOGAF are just some zealots and fanatics. So people who maybe are practitioners and they kind of see real best practices, and they also see that they don't really resemble TOGAF, but still they believe in the power of TOGAF regardless of any evidence, irrespective of any observations of their own. They start to say that yes, we don't work like that, but still it is very powerful. It would be great if we worked like that. They start to attribute some common sense ideas to TOGAF. They say, for example, TOGAF tells you that you need to speak with stakeholders, and this is very important. That's why TOGAF is very important, and that we have we describe business applications, data, and technology, and our architectural documents, and this is all TOGAF kind of told us to work like that. So that gives you a lot of kind of practical guidance, even though it's just a common sense. Or TOGAF lists some artifacts, and we kind of produce a couple of these artifacts. You see, this is all mentioned in TOGAF. So they start to attribute just ordinary common sense ideas that everybody does to TOGAF, and thank TOGAF for doing something very commonsensical. And often these people speak in some convoluted language and using some abstract terms, like TOGAF provides you fundamental foundation for doing enterprise architecture, or common language, without again being able to specify what this common language is, when common language in the enterprise architecture discipline is obviously different, because every organization uses their own terminology. So these are people who, for irrational reasons, believe in the power of TOGAF, and even if they know what real architecture practices look like, and even if they know that they don't really resemble TOGAF in any real detail, they still find some power in TOGAF. It attracts them, and they believe in the magical power of TOGAF irrespective of any evidence. Thank you very much for your attention.